Gotta wait for my colleagues. Plus, I have to finish dressing. Barbara, is she coming? Jim, where's Barbara? Oh, there she is. Okay. Okay, let's go ahead and start. Javier Becerra, Chairman of the House Democratic Caucus, joined by our Vice Chairman, Joe Crowley, from New York, and also pleased to be joined by two colleagues who have been very active and instrumental in trying to get America to move in a sound direction when it comes to our foreign policy and the use of our military force. Both Jim McGovern and Barbara Lee have been champions on the issue of making sure that America knows that Congress understands its constitutional obligations to be the ones who declare war or not, and to make sure that we are protecting the American people from activities with our military forces that would go beyond any constitutional powers. I think that's important to state, because for several months now, the American people have probably been wondering, does Congress recognize that the president is in Iraq and Syria with a lot of Americans who are now in harm's way as a result of an initiative that he launched towards the end of last year, which Congress validated. Many of us participated in that discussion, voted yes or no, either way, but the president got permission from Congress last year to send troops into Iraq and Syria with the intention of moving forward at some point with a full-blown debate. We would provide the president with congressional authorization for the use of military force in Iraq and Syria. 6 months into this year, and no word yet from Republican leaders whether this Republican Congress will undertake its constitutional obligations. We've seen a lot of other things happen. We've almost had a shutdown of the Department of Homeland Security. We have watched as Republicans have failed to move forward with an agenda for jobs, but the one thing that probably is as important as any in the Constitution for Congress, which is our obligation to determine whether or not we'll put the life of an American soldier on the line, this Congress is AWOL. And I applaud both Jim McGovern and Barbara Lee for their effort to try to put this front and center in the minds of not just the American public, but members of Congress who must vote. And while we had a discussion on any number of subjects right now in our caucus meeting, we devoted some time to this discussion because of the importance of this privileged resolution. This is the only route that we have in Congress to force the Republican majority to face its obligation to let us debate whether or not American soldiers should be in harm's way in Iraq and Syria. And for that, I'm very grateful. Let me yield now to our Vice Chairman before we yield to Jim McGovern and Barbara Lee for their comments. Vice Chairman Joe Crowley.
Thank you. I look forward to hearing from both Barbara Lee as well as Jim McGovern as well. But let me just say we're just 6 legislative days away from another deadline, back to deadline politics, back to cliff politics. The XM Bank is due to expire. A jobs program that levels the playing field for American corporation, American workers, in leveraging trade with other countries and making sure that we're selling products to other countries and have the advantage that other countries have given to their own companies here in the United States. Responsible for sustaining 164,000 export-related American jobs last year, created an estimated 1.3 million private sector jobs since 2009. The XM Bank has been a jobs creator for the United States and sustaining jobs in our country. This is no time to be playing shutdown politics once again. Deadline politics, it's become something we've become so used to here. This needs to end. Shutting down the government, shutting down XM, attempting to shut down the Department of Homeland Security. These tactics don't work. The American people are tired of this. They want to see the Congress moving forward with a jobs agenda, putting Americans back to work, and put away this nonsense and start working on the issues that the American people care about. And with that, I'll turn it to Jim McGovern.
Thank you, Javier and Joe. So 11 months ago, we had a vote in the House, a vote that prevailed by 370 to 40, which states that the President shall not deploy or maintain U.S. armed forces in a sustained combat role in Iraq without specific statutory authorization for such use. Democrats and Republicans voted to say that we have a constitutional responsibility that when it comes to war, we have to vote on an AUMF. That was 11 months ago. That was in July. In August, we began sustained military operations in Iraq. We are bombing every day in Iraq and Syria. We are spending about $3 million an hour in this fight against the Islamic State. We are deploying more and more American forces in a very dangerous part of the world. The President announced another deployment recently, and that is going to continue. And yet, Congress has been silent on this issue. We have pleaded with the Speaker of the House and the Republican leadership to let us do our job, to bring an AUMF to the floor for a debate and a vote. We were told in the 113th Congress that he would rather wait to the 114th Congress, even though this latest war began in the 113th Congress. Then he said in January, well, we would have to wait till the President submits an AUMF of his own. The President did. Whether you like what the President submitted or not, he did his job. Now it's time for us to do our job. If you like what the President did, bring it to the floor. If you want to expand it, then bring that to the floor. If you want to restrict it, then bring that to the floor. But the idea that we have thousands of men and women in harm's way, and we're sitting here twiddling our thumbs and trying to avoid a debate, demonstrates not only the ineffectiveness of this leadership, but quite frankly, it's moral cowardice that we are not debating this issue and we are not voting on it. I think those men and women who are in our armed forces believe that we ought to do our job. I think their families believe we ought to do our job. And I think the American people, whether you're a Democrat or Republican, want us to do our job. This should not be that controversial, and yet in this Congress it is. And so we've tried a variety of routes to force this debate to no effect. And so we have taken advantage of this privilege resolution. These are procedures under the War Powers Resolution, which allows us to bring to the floor a bill that says absent an authorization, then our troops have to be removed from Iraq and Syria within 6 months. If you want them to stay, then you have to vote on an AUMF. And I think it's just time for Congress to fish or cut bait on the war in Iraq and Syria. Either bring forward an AUMF and authorize the war, or bring our troops home to their families. And the privilege resolution that Barbara and I have introduced gives the House leadership 6 months to take up an AUMF, debate it and vote on it, or failing to do so requires the President to withdraw U.S. armed forces from the region. The ball is in Congress's court, and I hope that we have a good debate. This will be brought up tomorrow. We're told we're going to have 2 hours of debate. I hope we can raise some important issues. I hope we get a strong vote. But we need to pressure this leadership to do their job. Otherwise, they're not going to do it. I'll yield to Barbara.
Thank you very much. Let me thank, first of all, our leadership team for their support. It's very important that our chair and vice chair are here this morning supporting this effort, so I want to thank you both very much. And also to Congressman McGovern, who has been a true leader on making sure that, first of all, that our young men and women are not placed in harm's way, but secondly, that we do our job as members of Congress. So thank you very much, Jim. We've been fighting, yes, another war in the Middle East for the last 10 months, a war that Congress has yet to debate or authorize. Now, more than 4 months ago, President Obama sent a proposal to Congress for an AUMF, and in those 4 months, the House leadership has done nothing. They have not called a debate, they have not sought to amend or discuss the President's proposal, and they have not called a vote. Now, this is just downright outrageous. Congress has a moral and a constitutional duty to give the American people a voice in matters of war and peace. Yet the Speaker and his leadership team refuse to call a vote. Members on both sides of the aisle are beginning to support our calls for a debate and a vote. Just 2 weeks ago, my colleagues in the Appropriations Committee adopted my amendment to the Defense Appropriations Bill, reaffirming that Congress has a constitutional duty to debate the current war in the Middle East. That sense of Congress resolution was written into the base bill with 6 Republicans. I think that this will continue to build in terms of bipartisan support because members of Congress on both sides of the aisle know that people deserve a voice and Congress should do its job. Make no mistake, this privilege resolution really is not about a political agenda, as some have said. It's about forcing the constitutional mandate on yet another war in the Middle East. It's about giving the American people a voice on if and how our country goes to war. Whether you agree with going to war or not, we need to come to the floor of Congress and talk about that. Recently, we've learned that a base will be built in Iraq. We're not sure what that means. The American people need to know, is this a permanent base, which of course on a bipartisan basis, we have written that into the law over and over and over again, but we don't know if this is a permanent base or not. We hope not, but a debate would flesh all of these issues out. And so finally, let me just say it's about time that we do our job. The American people do not want to see us abdicate our responsibility as we are doing at this point. And so enough is enough. Hopefully we'll be able to get a bipartisan vote tomorrow, and we'll begin to really send a signal to the public that there are members of Congress who are going to insist that we do our job and do it in a way that all members have a voice on whether or not we should be in combat or be in war or not. And that's basically a very simple resolution, and it's a constitutional duty that we should perform. It's our job, and I thank all of our members for their support.
So I know there are a number of things we can we can talk about, but it's important to discuss this resolution because if we recall, back in 2001, 2001, when we gave the president, then President Bush, the authority to use our troops to go to war, it was for the purpose of going after Al-Qaeda, and we went into Afghanistan. 14 years later, that's the same authorization that's being used to justify our military activities in Iraq and Syria. We are in desperate need of an authorization that lets the American people know why we will be or won't be in Iraq or Syria. And just ironically or not, just down the hall here, we're having a discussion, we're watching Congress discuss the issue of Benghazi, which was a tragic incident where 4 Americans perished, which has been investigated numerous times. Some 7 or 8 reports have been issued on the Benghazi incident where our U.S. Embassy was attacked and those 4 Americans perished. But we haven't been able to get this Congress to focus on whether or not we should be sending our troops into Iraq and Syria. And so it's unfortunate that we're having to watch this occur, but we hope that we're able to deal with this soon. With that, we will stop and find out if there are any questions. Yes, sir.
Here's the question about trade. There's a lot of discussion about putting TAA in another package now, move that forward. I believe you opposed to that and TPA. Are you going to be working to try and shoot that down wherever it comes up? Are you talking with your colleagues about trying to make sure it doesn't pop up someplace else?
Before we go to the issue of trade, we'll take any questions that relate to this privilege resolution, but we will get back to that issue of trade. So are there any questions on the privilege resolution on whether or not we should give authority to have military force in Iraq or Afghanistan? We'll take those first.
I have a quick question.
Yeah.
How many Republicans have you spoken with, if any, who are supportive of this effort?
Well, Walter Jones is a co-sponsor with us, and I think we've talked to a number of Republicans who are very sympathetic. This is not a partisan issue. I think whatever the vote is tomorrow is going to be very bipartisan. Look, there are people in our caucus who support, a larger military footprint in that part of the world, and there are people who want a smaller one. But the same is true on the Republican side. We don't have a whip count. We just found out yesterday that this was going to be brought up today, but we're going to talk to our colleagues. But I think there'll be bipartisan support for this. Look, the people who are outraged by this are not just Democrats. Republicans are as well. Let me just say one thing too. I find it ironic that the leadership of this House routinely gets up and criticizes the White House for not involving Congress more in their day-to-day decision-making. But yet on the issue of war, they have no problem with basically turning over all of our constitutional responsibilities to the executive. I find that not only puzzling, I think that's outrageous.
Let me just mention, I said earlier that we were building bipartisan support, and when we offered the amendment in the Appropriations Committee, the Defense Appropriations Bill, we had 6 Republicans who voted for my amendment that said we should debate, Congress should debate and vote on a new authorization as it relates to ISIS. And so I think, more Republicans really understand what the American people are insisting on, and hopefully we'll build enough bipartisan support for tomorrow so that this can pass.
Any other questions on the resolution? If not, then let's go to the question on trade. Real quickly, pose the question one more time.
Yes, sorry to repeat myself. It sounds like now the administration is talking with some members of the Democrats and Republicans about how to bring up the TAA bill in a different way, perhaps using the preferences bill, the conference bill, to get that through. All in an effort to get TPA done, you've opposed that, or you're working with your caucus, try to squash that out wherever it pops up. What's the plan now?
Well, I don't think anyone, whether it's the American public or anyone in Congress that's been elected to serve the American people, would want to be blindsided on something like a trade vote. We just had a vigorous discussion and vote last week on this, and it was a pretty clear vote, an emphatic vote that brought down that trade legislation. And so we would all hope that whatever is done in the plain sight of day and not through some backroom deal that would have us voting on something unaware of what the consequences might be. And so I would hope that the Republican leadership is not trying to connive some way of trying to resurrect a bill that lost the vast majority of Republican votes, not just Democratic votes. There were more Republican votes, 158, who voted against the Republican legislation on trade adjustment assistance, along with the 144, I believe, Democrats who voted against that same legislation. So by an overwhelming number, bipartisanly, Republicans and Democrats, that legislation was rejected, and we would hope that there would be no effort to try to, in an underhanded way, try to slip that legislation through, because I don't think it's not just the members of Congress who would be upset. I think the American people would be very upset. Joe, I don't know if you would.
I would just say the same that the chairman has said, is that the American people think this place is cynical enough to see such a bill go down in the numbers that it did go down in. The process is moving forward. I don't think we certainly would not be happy if the Republicans tried to maneuver behind the scenes, either through a rule or some other mechanism to try to thwart the intention of the Congress right now. I think there will be a political price to be paid for that if they attempt to do that.
Quick follow-up?
Yes, would your mind be changed if you got a highway bill? Some path forward on that?
I think all of us want to see transportation legislation, because we know all the jobs that are at stake by not having Republicans put forward a long-term transportation funding bill. That doesn't mean that makes the problems in the trade legislation better. We should be focusing on jobs legislation. And I think most of us agree that transportation legislation is a jobs bill. If it's done right, it's a jobs bill. But we haven't seen Republicans put forward a long-term transportation bill for a long time, and they're having us vote on these measures for transportation that are 2 months long. No contractor who's building a subway or a highway can make decisions on how much lumber and cement and concrete to buy based on a 2-month authorization for money. And so this is crazy. They're two separate things, trade and transportation. But certainly I think there's an appetite in Congress to finally get some real work done that would help us create jobs. By the way, procedurally, we already see some of the shenanigans beginning. Apparently today we're voting on a rule, a procedural vote, which most Americans wouldn't sort of get the whole gist of, because it doesn't have anything to do with the substance of the legislation we might pass and become law. But there's a procedural vote that contains something very important, a provision that allows the Speaker to continue his ability to bring up the trade legislation that died overwhelmingly on a bipartisan vote at any time he wants between now and the end of July, when under the rules of this House, the Speaker would have to bring up that trade legislation for reconsideration by today. And so we're already seeing some of this, shady stuff occurring, where using a rule on a totally separate matter, the Speaker is including a provision that deals with the trade legislation that was voted down last week and must be reconsidered for a vote by today. And so that's the kind of activity that has to raise people's alarms that what this Congress might try to do under Republican leadership is sneak through legislation which overwhelmingly, on a bipartisan basis, members of Congress rejected. So we'll see. Joe, I don't know if you wish to comment on the.
No,
Okay. Let's go here and then go here.
I have, on trade, at what point do you risk losing the TAA with you guys voting against it, you're committing to voting against it, but it will expire at the end of September. Republicans say they will not bring it up, and they feel quite burned by Democrats at this point. Is there ever a point that there's a reconsideration of your strategy to ensure that TAA?
So I think we want to make sure we're clear on the issue of TAA, which is Trade Adjustment Assistance, to separate that from TPA, Trade Promotion Authority. So Trade Promotion Authority is the fast track bill that allows the administration to negotiate a bill for trade without having to do anything more than come to Congress for an up or down vote, versus allowing Congress to be more participatory in that process. The TAA, which is legislation to help American workers who lose their job as a result of trade bills, is an important matter for a lot of us. And there are ways that you can make that trade adjustment assistance work well. This legislation put forward by our Republican colleagues, without participation by Democrats in helping shape that legislation, clearly didn't have support in this Congress. Clearly it had problems in the House of Representatives on a bipartisan basis. If you want to see who brought down the trade adjustment assistance legislation last week, talk to the 158 Republicans who voted against their own party's trade adjustment assistance legislation. That 144 Democrats voted against it should not be a surprise, since many of us from the very beginning informed our Republican colleagues that that trade adjustment assistance legislation was woefully inadequate. It left out workers who might be impacted by trade, who might lose their jobs. It didn't have enough funds to deal with the largest trade agreement that might be shaped and passed into law. And it concluded cuts to Medicare, which more than 50 million Americans rely on for their services after having paid into the program for Medicare. This bill, TAA bill, would have cut Medicare to cover the cost of providing dislocation assistance to Americans who lost their job. That was a non-starter for a lot of us. And so for all those reasons and more, many Democrats said this is not the trade adjustment assistance that we would vote for. Having said that, if there's a trade adjustment assistance bill that is done for the purpose of helping Americans who lose jobs as a result of trade agreements, we're ready and willing to talk. But this is not the bill that could get Democratic support. Nobody should be surprised. What's probably the surprising matter is that Republicans put up their trade adjustment assistance bill and couldn't get their own Republican colleagues to vote for their Republican trade adjustment assistance bill.
Respectfully, though, it's not just Republicans' bill, it's President Obama's bill, the leader of your party as well. You guys voted against him. TA will expire. I understand you didn't like the package, but at some point is there a reconsideration of strategy saying TA will go away? It's Obama's bill as well as the Republicans' bill. Do Democrats, are you ready to watch TA expire?
So again, as far as I know, this bill was drafted by Republicans. I know as a Democrat on the Committee of Jurisdiction, I had no opportunity to provide input. I know of no Democrat who had an opportunity to provide input. That the president is trying to push a trade agenda, that's been clear for quite some time, many, many years. And that the president has to work with a Republican Congress should not surprise anyone either. that this is the trade adjustment assistance bill that the president had to work with Republican leaders in the House and Senate. I recognize that the president has to do what he believes is best, given that there's a Republican Congress. But to call this anything but a Republican trade adjustment assistance bill would be a mistake and would be a misrepresentation of this bill. The moment that Republicans include Democrats in the drafting of that legislation, we could talk differently. But until then, this was a Republican trade adjustment assistance bill, which even Republicans wouldn't support.
Let me just follow up just momentarily, Jonathan, on that. And that is, there's tremendous skepticism in the Congress as it pertains to trade bills. That has nothing to do with the president, quite frankly. It has to do with the lack of environmental standards and labor standards in these agreements. And that's something new. That's something that's been worked on for quite some time. And there's growing skepticism, I think growing opposition to these agreements. But as the chairman said, when the bill came from the Senate, where Republicans and Democrats and Paul Ryan worked on the legislation and came to the House without the input of the Democratic minority, one would think that if trade justice assistance was being added to entice Democrats to vote for it, they would at least allow Democrats to participate in determining what is actually in the TAA. And at every effort to have some influence was thwarted by the rules of the committee, and then also in terms when it came to the floor. So let's make no mistake about this. There was no Democratic input, either in the TAA or the TPA bill that came before the House. Regardless of the President's support, it's about what has been a growing skepticism on trade here in the House. And I would say not just on the Democratic side of the aisle, but the Republican side of the aisle as well. I think what the leader has been talking about, our leader, a new paradigm for trade, I think that's what we maybe should be looking at now and focusing and shifting, as opposed to trying to continue to bring up motions to try to move this forward when clearly the Congress has indicated otherwise.
Congressman, you've talked a lot about the lopsided vote on TAA. What about the vote on TPA? 219 of your colleagues voted for this bill, including 20-some Democrats. Aren't House Democrats now engaging in the sort of political tactics, the hostage-taking that you have criticized Republicans for over the past few years?
Recall that 219 is just over the bare majority to pass legislation. The way that 219 votes was cobbled together to pass Trade Promotion Authority, the fast-track legislation, should one day be the subject of a book or a movie. So it's not a matter of what we in the minority... Documentary? Well, I'd be too ugly to be a documentary. I think you'd have to do it as a movie. What the minority on the House side, the Democrats on the House side have said is, we can fashion a good trade promotion authority bill that would make sure that America's interests are not only protected but promoted. Most of us from the very beginning made it very clear this is not a TPA bill that could get our support. That then our Republican colleagues in the majority try to figure out a way to cobble those votes together, including providing a TAA bill, Trade Adjustment Assistance Bill, packaged together so they could get some votes. That was up to them. That they misjudged their own Republican colleagues in terms of voting for a Republican Trade Adjustment Assistance Bill is not the maneuvering of Democrats. And so I think it makes it very clear that trade is not only an important item in our legislative agenda, but it's also a very important item in the minds of the American people. They want to know that trade is done right, because we want to know that we're not just opening up our market to for folks to import their goods here. We want to make sure that we have a chance to compete fair and square. If we're given a chance to compete fair and square, American business and American workers will do very well. Unfortunately, Americans have gotten to know that too often trade is not done fairly and squarely. And that I think, is the reason why today we're moving on, hopefully, to something else that helps us deal with jobs for the American people. Yes. Oh, I'm sorry. Jonathan was next, and then we'll be.
Your leading Democratic presidential candidate, Hillary Clinton, has sort of struggled with this TPP question. Said yesterday, or refused to say yesterday, whether she supports TPA in general, which is unusual for presidential candidates. Do you worry at all that you're handing Republicans a 2016 campaign issue that they would like to run on if this bill
I think Hillary Clinton reflected both the interest and the apprehensions of the American people when it comes to trade, when she said that we need to have some trade legislation that really guarantees us that Americans will gain jobs as a result of this. And I think she spoke directly, not just to the minds, but the hearts of American people who are saying, we think trade is good. We all engage in trade in some way or another, and we want to make sure it works. But she made it very clear. There's got to be an ultimate goal here with regard to trade, and that is more business, more jobs for Americans. And so I think she was spot on her comments.
And you're not worried that Republicans will be able to use this as a campaign issue if it does in the House?
I think we're ready to advocate for American jobs everywhere we go. And any candidate for president who doesn't believe that the most important thing about trade is creating jobs is going to, I think, find the wrath of the American voter waiting for him. So if any Republican wants to take on, whether it's Hillary Clinton or any other Democrat on the issue of trade, I think if Democrats are standing behind American jobs and American workers and American businesses, that to me doesn't create any political problem for anybody except those who are opposed to American jobs and American workers.
I'll just add, Jonathan, really investing in America. I think that's also what Hillary Clinton is talking about. Doing a highway bill, doing an infrastructure bill, putting Americans back to work, investing in the 21st century, investing in our schools, and making sure we're prepared to really compete in this century when it comes to trade. As I said before, she's also, well, I should say that she also mentioned they should listen to Nancy Pelosi more. She said that as well. What she's saying is they should listen to the Democratic minority in the House of Representatives more and not push us aside as if we don't matter. Because that's quite frankly what took place here. Just completely pushed aside and said that your issues don't matter. They're not even going to be included in any of the legislation we're bringing up. So that was also a hallmark of what I believe she said yesterday as well.
We'll try to wrap up with one or
I just wanted to follow up on TAA. You keep calling it the Republican Trade Adjustment Assistance Bill. I mean, this program, as you well know, has been a Democratic priority created by Democrats, protected by unions and Democrats. So you now are saying it's no longer a Democratic priority?
No. I've said the Republican legislation. You're absolutely right. Democrats have fought for resources to help Americans who are displaced as a result of trade, because it's a fact. Everyone knows that trade does lead to job loss in America. It results in job gain in other sectors as well. No one denies that. There is a debate about whether there's a greater job loss or greater job gain as a result of trade, but no one denies that trade has consequences. And so Democrats have always fought to make sure that Americans who lose their job, not because they weren't doing their work, not because they weren't productive, but because a trade agreement that they had nothing to do with, but a trade agreement leads to the loss of that American job, that, hey, if the American government is going to sign off on a trade deal, and as a result of that government activity, you lose your job, then the government owes you some opportunity to get back to work, get trained, put yourself back on your feet. And so we have always supported the effort of making sure that if we sign off on trade, that we recognize that some industries and some Americans are going to lose out. We've always supported that. But Democrats have never said, in order to cover the costs of helping that American who lost his job because of trade get back on his feet, we're going to have to tell some senior who paid into to Medicare that we're going to cut that senior's benefits in Medicare to cover the costs of that American who's trying to get back on his feet. That's crazy. Well, that's what this Republican legislation on trade adjustment assistance essentially said. It said, we're going to cut Medicare to cover some of the costs of this TAA bill. We said from the very beginning, that's a non-starter with us because we're not asking to take from Peter to give to Paul. So there are a number of issues that are problematic in the Republican legislation for reauthorization of trade adjustment assistance. But we have always supported trade adjustment assistance, and we'll support trade adjustment assistance when it's backed by legislation to authorize it to do the right stuff, not play games.
Let me just add to that. Clearly, trade adjustment assistance is something that Democrats have consistently supported over the Republican objection. Quite frankly, they don't believe in trade adjustment assistance because they believe it contravenes the fair markets. We recognize that trade adjustment assistance helps not only those who lose their jobs through trade, but through globalization as well. It's the way in which this bill was brought to the floor and the substance within it, or the lack thereof. Many on our side did not believe there was enough money within, although the administration thought there was, and Republicans put what they wanted to put into it. We thought we could do more. We did not like the pay-fors. Many of us didn't like the pay-fors that were bargained afterwards in removing the larger or the blanket extension of sequestration, the blowing of the cap of 2%, and adding another $700 million on the backs of Medicare beneficiaries. But you talk about hostage taking. You know, as the Republicans are running out of the bank with the trade bill, they grabbed TAA and they joined them together and said, you're not going to get TAA unless we get a chance to pass the TPA bill. So that was where the link in terms of hostage taking was done, was to try to force more votes for TPA by getting a TAA bill on as well. In fact, the reverse is what happened. The House just pulled away and said, I'm not going to be used as a guinea pig. I'm not going to be used as your fodder in this particular case. And I think what really has been said now is that the ball's thrown back into their court. Bring up a TAA bill separate even, that is something Democrats support. Bring up a TPA bill that's separate here in the House, and you can do your will, have the body do its will. Then send it back to the Senate and have the Senate work its will.
Last question.
I just wanted to clarify, Congressman, you were talking about, the shady stuff Republicans were doing by putting this, putting the extension to consider the vote on TAA to extend it to July 30th. Were you prepared? Did Democrats want to vote to reconsider TAA today? Is that something that you guys wanted to do?
So the TAA bill had its day in court in Congress. It had its vote last week, and it went down. What was the final vote? 124? Was it supposed? It went down 2-1. For every member of Congress who voted for the TAA bill last week, there were 2 members who voted against it. Bipartisanly voted against it. And so at the last moment, the Speaker used a procedural tactic to be able to recall that bill up for a vote again, which under the rules would have to take place this week. Now, it failed miserably last week, and maybe there was a sense by the Speaker that they could twist enough arms and get enough votes this week. I guess they found that they couldn't turn votes. So rather than do what under the rules they're supposed to do in the House, which is to have that vote for reconsideration come up now, today, the Republican leadership put in a provision in a totally separate bill, having nothing to do with trade, a provision that allows that reconsideration of the vote to occur anytime between now and the end of July. I'm not even sure that under that provision, members of Congress are even provided with notice that such a vote might take place. And so, can you do that? Well, when you're the Speaker and you control the House of Representatives, you can do a whole lot of things procedurally. And that's what we find going on. Is that something that's acceptable to most members or to the American public to watch the People's House driven this way? I don't think so. But again, there's not a lot we can do except be vigilant and be ready. And once again, as I said, American people want to make sure we do the right thing. They are very apprehensive whenever we have a trade vote in Congress for these very reasons, because they're not sure that it's on the up and up, that Congress is doing the best thing for them. If it were, why would you need to do these things through underhanded procedural activities rather than have a straight-up vote, which, as we saw last week, failed 2-1. I don't know if, Joe, you want to comment? With that, we'll close. Thank you all very much. Is this yours or is that?
Thanks.